Is your church guilty of these 10 visitor-repelling behaviors?
We've compiled real reports from church visitors detailing what scares them off.
Because you only get to make one first impression.
So let's make it a good one.
Let's dive in! Well, hey there, and welcome to the Pro Church Tools Show. We're here to help you and your church navigate the biggest communication shift in 500 years. I'm Brady Shear, your host. I'm joined as always by my co-host. It's the man that we call Pastor Palm, Alexander Mills.
Hello, hello.
So these are real reports that we have today from people that have visited churches and given their feedback on the not so fun things that these churches did. They're compiled from our YouTube comment section. Alex, take us away with number one.
The first one we call the new visitor spotlight. This comment comes from a user handle @dherndon. You come to our little church, they want you to fill a visitor card, and the pastor will tell everyone your name and says, and I quote, "Give them a hand clap." I think the hand clap would feel weird to the visitors.
I want to know the difference between a hand clap and just like a round of applause. Is a hand clap somehow more in the theme of like offering, whereas round of applause is too secular?
Calling them out by name is tough. Asking them to stand, yikes. But a hand clap?
A hand clap. So this is obviously done with the objective of honoring the new visitor.
Yeah, welcome.
And acknowledging the new visitor. But the reality is, despite the best intentions from churches, this almost always makes people feel uncomfortable. Visiting churches, we have to remember, is not an easy experience for most people. It's not akin to visiting a restaurant on the spectrum of comfort. It's usually challenging because you're talking about entering a place that's going to be discussing really intense issues. You know, we talk about church dealing with the existential matters of life and faith and eternity and purpose and hope and community. And to make someone the spotlight and subject of attention, despite the best intentions by the senior leadership, is almost always, we would recommend avoiding it. Now, I do think it's worth mentioning, you know, the topic that we're discussing here. The aim is to make people feel comfortable when they come to church. And certainly there are going to be people that are watching and listening that are against that ideal altogether. And so to explain kind of like my approach to this, I want the wisdom of Scripture and a life with Jesus to be as accessible as possible to people that are far from God, so long as we don't compromise the gospel in the process. But I also recognize that some people are like, look, if you come into the church, I don't want you to feel comfortable. This church is not for you. This church is for the saints. And our job is to go out into the world and we tell people about Jesus. But when we meet together as a family on Sunday, like, you're not going to feel fit in. And that's intentional. Two different styles of church. If that's your style of church, this is not going to be your style of episode, frankly. And so feel free to move along. I also want to say one more disclaimer. There's going to be a lot in this episode, right? We've got 10 different items to go through. We're not trying to heap more of a burden onto anyone's plate. And so I just want to like explain how I listen to episodes that are like this. I go through an episode. My goal is to get one thing, just one, that I can actually take action on. That's preferable over hearing all 10 and being like, I agree with all 10, and then never actually implementing any of them. So if you listen to all 10, you're like, man, there's a lot of people that come to church and they don't like a lot of things.
Yeah.
We're doing everything wrong. Say, hey, we're just highlighting things that are happening. Just pick one that you're like, you know what? We do engage in that bad habit and we can easily remedy it and do that.
Yeah. We're going to hit on 10 of these things that churches do that can scare off newcomers. And most of them, if not all of them, surely are well-intentioned. You know, folks who are leading in the church, working in the church, who want to welcome new visitors. But for most folks who are leading or working in churches, it's likely been a very long time since you've been a visitor or a newcomer at a church. And so it's just good to just gain a little bit of perspective from the people on the internet, from people who are very likely new visitors visiting churches. And so this is what they have to say. You want to move on to number 2?
Well, yeah. And we're taking it directly from the YouTube comment section.
Yes.
Like we're not saying this is how a variety of different people have felt. And so we want to hear what they have to say. Okay,
so number 2, we're calling this insider jargon or traditions. User I'm going to butcher all of these. Lo Vasquez 7198 says, explaining how to find a specific verse on a Bible. I remember the first time I heard someone quote something from the Bible and not knowing what they were talking about.
Okay, so think about fine dining. Most people don't like fine dining. Fine dining is reserved for a certain subset of the population. The reason most people don't like it is because it's a very much if you know kind of experience. It's meant to be for people that get it. And if you don't get it, you're supposed to think, why is this portion so small? Why did they do this to that food? Why is it plated this way? Why am I eating food? Is this art or is this food? Like,
or even to this comment, like the language, you open the wine list, or even the menu, even the words on the menu that are describing cooking techniques that are in French verbiage. It's like, I don't actually know what language we're speaking here. We're not on the same page.
100%. If you want to keep using jargon and traditions, the risk that you run in church is creating an experience like that. I think there's a way to do this well, because what we don't want is to completely like get rid of the church jargon and church traditions for the sake of making church accessible to people. I don't think, because a lot of what makes church is that jargon and traditions. And so this is really like a fine line to walk. A really simple rule of thumb to walk this well, I think, is when you do any type of thing in church, whether it's use a phrase or engage in a certain liturgy or rhythm or habit, whatever it might be, bit of programming, is just give it a very brief explanation for what it is. What this does is it actually invites people that are outside of the circle into the circle, which in many ways is better than not using the jargon or traditions at all.
Yes.
Because you're basically saying like, yeah, we are a church. This is our way of life. This is our worldview. We're not the same as the world, and we have our own set of language and our own set of doing things. But those don't exist to keep you separate.
Yeah.
We want to invite you into what these are, and they might be foreign and unfamiliar at first. So let me give you a very brief explanation.
Yeah.
So if you do something like communion, you can briefly explain like, why do we do this? And that way someone's like, okay, maybe I'm ready to engage with this. Maybe I'm not, but at the very least, it's not this foreign thing that's creating distance between me and the church.
Yeah, I will employ this a lot, actually in a similar way to this comment. So when I'm preaching, if we're preaching on a text, a Bible verse that in the Christian tradition is familiar, you'll often hear a preacher say like, oh, I'm sure you've heard this story, or you guys know how this story goes.
Right.
Which from like a thoroughly Christian perspective, that's probably true. Most people who are churched may be familiar with the story you're about to read. But I just reform that language a little and say, you may have heard the story before, or if you're hearing it for the first time, you're in for a good one. Just something like that acknowledges that like, yes, this is a familiar story. We're reading the story of the prodigal son again, but there are folks in the room that are hearing it for the first time, and they deserve to be acknowledged and, like you said, welcomed into the fold as well. And so it really once you start putting an effort towards just tending to this language a little bit, it doesn't take much effort, but the rewards for new visitors are just incredible.
Right. So you could say something in this example. Hey, if you could turn to Matthew chapter 11, and then you could say, Matthew, one of the Gospels, probably be closer to the second third of your Bible if you're opening it, first book of the New Testament. And now you've kind of like just it took you 3 seconds.
Yes.
You just gave a little bit of context. And now someone that has never turned to that book in the Bible before, they have at least some type of like, okay, you got me in the world a little bit. It's also not taking away from anyone that's in the room.
Exactly. And
maybe that's normal for Matthew. But, if you're like deep in the minor prophets and you're like calling out one of those, you can say, that's actually one of the minor prophets, roughly middle, a little bit later than the middle in your Bible if you're just opening it right there.
Yeah.
Of course, if we're all using digital Bibles, this problem's solved anyways. Thank you, tech, for again solving a problem.
Well, we say that again at our church on Sundays. When we open the text, we say, hey, if you have your Bibles with you, turn to this passage. If you don't have a Bible with you, either just let us know and we'll give you one, or the words will be up on the screen. Or if you just want to simply close your eyes and let the gospel wash over you, that's good too. And so we say that every time we open the scriptures, just like no matter where anyone, whether they are churched or unchurched, whatever they're bringing to the space, whatever headspace they're in that day, they feel at ease and relaxed in the presence of what we're doing, which is like very religious activity. And that's the risk here which is like censoring our language to the point where like we lose some of the rich religious tradition that we have and that's important to our faith. And so I think this is the perfect middle ground, which is using the language, but defining it when it's necessary.
That additional phrasing takes just a few seconds, but it makes all the difference.
Yes. Next one, we're calling this forced small talk and mingling. Comment comes from at pineapple 3555. The avatar is A pineapple. They say, I hate shaking hands. I literally had a breakdown the last time I went to church. Now I have to go again in a couple of hours with my family, and I'm here crying. There's definitely something wrong with me. Listen, Pineapple 3555. I'm not sure there's something wrong with you, but I think maybe you have a little bit of anxiety that you might want to talk to a therapist about.
Look, social anxiety is a real thing.
Yes.
And I would venture to guess that it is the minority of people that enjoy the turn to your neighbor and shake their hands part of service. And there's a reason why most churches don't do this anymore. That being said, I don't have a firm recommendation for what you should do or what you should not do here, because similar to our previous item on the list, like, we want people to not just come to church and engage in the spectator sport of sitting in the pew and listening. We want them to rub shoulders with the people in the faith community. And one of the easiest ways to get them to rub shoulders is by literally forcing them.
And you can't make them you definitely can't make them come early, and you can't make them stay late. So if you get them right in the middle and say, you need to turn around right now and shake the hand of the person next to you, they're not going anywhere.
Are we saying we need to bring this back?
We still do it.
Are we old?
Yes.
I feel like 5 years ago on this show, we would have been like, look, we're in our 20s and we need to stop with this. And now we're in our 30s and we're like, I mean, the thing is, like, don't you want to meet, like, the woman next to you and say, like, hi, like, oh, you're a nice old lady that comes to church. Oh, you're someone my age. Or you're someone, I've never met you before. Like,
here's what you shouldn't do, though. You're a pastor.
Okay.
Closing the service. You're praying.
Okay.
And you say, reach over and grab the hand of the person next to you. You can't be doing that. We can't be doing that. We can't be forcing people to grab the hand of the person next to them, but we can invite them mid-service. Hey, we've just finished singing. I invite you to take this few moments and say hi to the people around you.
That's just the laying of hands that
Go ahead, greet them with a holy kiss. Why don't you?
Pastor Pentecostal kind of turning his back on his tradition.
Do you guys do this at Central? Like, because that's big church.
Yeah. And for whatever reason, and this is, I think, why I included it on the list, at church on Sunday, I was like waiting for it to happen.
Yeah.
We don't normally do it, but like there was this lull, and I was like, is it going to happen? Because our church does tend to like mix up programming a lot in a way that I really appreciate.
Okay.
Like, we have like our core stuff, but we're always doing things that are slightly different. So like, pastor was preaching this week, and he invited another pastor on stage to tell a specific story that was relevant to the message. The message was about gentleness and the fruit of the Spirit. I didn't really get to hear it because my child's name got flashed on the screen because she was having a meltdown.
Yeah.
So first time that had ever happened to me.
Which one, big one or little one?
A little one.
Okay.
Yeah. Central 133, please come to the door because your child is having a meltdown. And I was like, so then you have to do like the walk of shame out of church.
Yes,
Luckily, we were seated near the back.
Nice.
But we still had to walk through like 10 rows. So yeah, we didn't do it. Felt like it was about to happen. And I was like, no. And I was like,
I like the Catholic Church. They offer peace. You just stay in your pew and you just look around and you do the peace sign at everyone.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, no touching.
I'm open to bringing in traditions cross denominations.
There you go, ecumenical. Moving on, inauthentic or incomplete online footprint at Dingebold says we've moved many times, and finding a new church is always a task. I will often go to a Wednesday night service if they have one. You can get a real feel about the core people at a service other than a Sunday service.
So inarguably,
Wow.
that's a pro move.
That's a veteran move.
It should be unnecessary.
Yeah.
The reason this person does this is because they've moved frequently, they've visited new churches frequently, and they have found almost always that they go to a church and they like don't get an accurate feel for what they were expecting
From the online presence. And we've talked about this a lot recently about how photos of real people from your church should be the foundational design element of your church's website, so that when folks are looking for a new church in a new area, they search Church My Area, they land on your church's website, immediately they're seeing real photos of real smiling people from your church in your church space. Similarly, on Instagram, a lot of younger folks are skipping right past the website and opening your Instagram to see how active you are and what your church looks like. Not the outside of the building, the inside. What does the service look like? What do the people look like? And we're calling this inauthentic or incomplete online footprint. This is to say, when folks look for a church online and they see something or they see nothing, and then they come in person and it's incongruent, that's disorienting to a new visitor.
Yeah, and again, we probably think the church has the best intentions in mind.
Sure.
When I say inauthentic, that can be interpreted as oh, they're trying to hide something. I don't really mean that. I just don't mean like it's a congruent representation. It's not an accurate representation, or it's an incomplete representation. And if it's incomplete, it might be missing crucial elements. And so this person has basically developed a routine to go to events that they are confident that they can ascertain, okay, this is what this church is really about, because the online presence has not filled in the gaps of what a single Sunday morning is missing. You can't put it on a single Sunday morning to perfectly represent what a church is all about. You're not going to get like, what are your core beliefs? Who are all the people that are pastors here? What's every ministry opportunity in this church? What do you have outside of a Sunday service? Like, that's not all happening in a single Sunday service. If it is, you've got a bigger problem because your announcements are 35 minutes long, and that would be item 11 on here.
Exactly.
And so the online presence of the church is meant to fill in those gaps. If I visit a church for the first time and my questions on beliefs, staffing, ministry opportunities, if that's all answered, then I don't have to evaluate that or look for the missing pieces, and I can just enjoy and experience a Sunday morning because those gaps have already been filled in.
Exactly. Moving on, the next one, this one's tough. This one is just when churches are unfriendly. At Lonnie Saint 655 says, I feel ya. Churches are some of the most unfriendly places ever. It's sad. I think you'll find doing stuff at home is better.
Churches can be very cliquey. We know this. And churches, especially smaller churches, function a lot of times like family. And when you've known the same people for a long time and you see them every single week and you sit in the same spot and you feel a lot of ownership in the ministry, and then somebody comes in, just like human nature is like, you might be a bit standoffish. You might not mean to, but you shoot them a dirty look that they interpret as, I'm not welcome here.
They sit in a seat that belongs to somebody else.
And then a violent occurrence takes place. And so leadership can do a lot here. I think leadership might feel like, how am I supposed to control someone shooting a dirty look at a new visitor? The language that you use becomes the culture that you build. And so even Pastor Alex earlier describing how he would talk about scripture. Hey, we're going to turn to this in our Bibles. If you don't have a Bible, this and this. It's up on the screen, or just listen and let it wash over you. That's language that he's using to set the understanding with the existing congregation. There might be new people here, and we want to make them feel welcome. If that language comes from the pulpit, from the top down, repeatedly, the language you use becomes the culture that you build. If you're never using that language, and you might think, like, I don't want to use that language because like no one new ever comes here. When someone does, they become one of the people in this YouTube comment section because the newcomer was scared off because this church had never built the habit.
Exactly.
They had never kind of built the well before they needed the water.
You've said it so well. A church of your size, Central, the largest church in the Niagara region, has built this into, and most large churches build this into their shared language, because on any given Sunday, there's likely new people there. So you know that we have to address them. But a church like mine, which is the average church size in America, so we're speaking to a large part of our listenership right now. You said it. Not every week is there someone new. And so sometimes you get up there and you think like, oh, I know everyone in the room, so I don't need to say this. There's no risk or there's no detriment to saying it anyways. And so we've built this into whenever a speaker gets up, they introduce themselves at our church. Hey, if you don't know me, my name's Alexander. I'm one of the pastors here. We say the thing with the scriptures. And at the end of every service, we come to the table and we say the same script. We invite people to the table the same way every week as if there's new people in the room, because coming to the table in different denominations has different meaning, even different rules. And so we make sure to say those every Sunday so that, like you said, when we do have a new visitor, there's no risk of forgetting to say that because we're saying it every week.
I want to read a Slack message that I got from an employee this past week. Now, it's become a running joke in the Slack that I will read Slacks from employees on air.
Yes.
And make it anonymous, but then slander them. They, of course, listen to the show and realize it's about them.
Some of them do. Some of them do not.
And then they tell on me to the ones that do not. So he said...
Oh, you've already given away his gender. Okay.
Okay. Not important. So if busy, feel free to disregard this. But I'm curious, as a church comms expert and one with your pulse on these trends in communication, how do you feel about the trend of introducing oneself as one of the pastors here?
Oh, interesting.
Because you just said that that's how you introduce yourself. I've personally found it a bit corny.
Oh!
And confusing for pragmatic reasons. When I was in a season of searching for a new church, it made it confusing to know which pastor to ask about what. When the youth pastor calls himself one of the pastors here, or the senior pastor does the same, I just have to take a wild guess on who to track down after service to ask about the church's youth group, or things relating to the main service, for example.
See, good feedback. Listen, this is perfect. This is feedback you're getting from someone who has gone church shopping recently, and I have not. In fact, I've never gone church shopping, not one time in my life. So that's valuable feedback. I'm not sure I'm going to change what I say, but at least I get to think about it.
Well, I told him, I was like, you are articulating some cons to that language that I think has merit, but the trade-offs are this, and this. And I was like, I think it's more casual. I think it doesn't put the senior pastor as like, I'm above everyone else. And I think it really lends itself well to like, hey, we are all followers of Jesus here. And this is not like, I'm in charge and you all follow what I say.
Yeah.
And I think that that's worth the trade-offs. But I think that's also illustrative of, we're not here trying to install all of these items as like, your church must do this. We're reading these comments from real people to basically just demonstrate, this is how people sometimes feel when this happens.
Yeah.
You might still choose to do this thing. So for example, hey, church uses jargon. Church uses these traditions that are like really churchy. That can make people feel like outsiders. We're not saying rush to stop doing those, but provide a way for people that are not familiar with that for it to be accessible to them. You might also hear this and be like, that one's not for me. And that's okay. Remember what we said at the beginning?
Yes.
Just try to pick one thing.
See if you can pick this next one. A lack of structure. At Bobby Johnson 5637 says, for me, with bad nerves and anxiety, being in a church where they're just screaming and shouting and hollering makes me super uncomfortable.
Yeah, I have been in some charismatic services where I have had to debrief with the pastor that took me afterwards because I was like, I did not care for that personally. And this might just come down to personality, but you know, back in the day when you have a bulletin and it would say like, here's like what we're doing, order of service.
Yes.
And you could kind of like follow along and be like, okay, here's where we are. This is what we're doing. And here's what's coming next.
Absolutely necessary at a funeral.
Do we need to bring it back on a Sunday morning? I'm open to it. You got the planning center rundown. Just share it with the public.
just on the screen. This is our order of service.
At 10:37, Pastor John walks on screen. It's like, oh, Pastor John.
Haulers for 47 minutes.
10:38, Pastor John's late.
There we go.
Do you have any thoughts on this? And is it just personality? Does the church have some responsibility for like, if you're trying to engage with new people and Sunday morning is complete chaos? I mean, also like I'm a white, and certainly my tradition with church is a lot more structured than perhaps black church. And that's like differences in culture, not even personality.
Yes. So I have the same relationship that anyone our age has with printed materials, which is like, we got away from them. Do we really need to bring them back? That being said, and I made the joke earlier, at a funeral, it's very handy to know what's coming up next. How many songs are we singing? How many people are speaking? How long are we going to be in at this thing, doing this thing?
It's good for a funeral. Why not?
So, and then you've got like mainline churches that do this, right? Like they have order of services. And so you do, if you are a visitor, and this is for visitors, like you're in a new space, maybe you have kids, like you need to know the timing, like how long are we in for this for? Like the order of service is important. And so if you're not going to do printed materials, maybe it's just as simple as doing verbal transitions at the beginning or end of every part of the service. So welcoming folks, like saying, hey, set the expectation, welcome to church. For the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to be singing some songs. Feel free to stand if you're able. After the singing, say, hey, for the next few moments, we're going to exchange grace and peace, greet the person next to you, and the kids are going to go out after that. And then when the pastor comes up, hey, welcome to church. I'm Alexander, one of the pastors here. We're going to like wrestle with the scriptures for about 20 minutes or so before we move on to meeting at the communion table. So you could do verbal or vocal transitions maybe as a middle ground there.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think you listen to all this feedback, and again, you're just like, okay, so like I can't do this, I can't do this, I can't do this, because people feel anxious about this and they feel like uncomfortable about this. And so this isn't about saying their perspective is right and we have to do everything like that, but more to provide understanding of how some things make some people feel, and then for us to make the calls as leaders. That's what leaders do.
Yes.
You know, the decisions are not always easy. Okay, we're going to do this, and we know that the trade-off might be this, so we're going to try to offset that as much as possible by doing this.
Exactly. Moving on. Too much recruitment in the service. At Value Calc says many visitors probably never go back. Instead of building faith, ministers want to discuss fundraising projects and wish to recruit many volunteers.
Yeah, that would be tough if you go for the first time and you hear say, hey, please give.
Yeah.
Please sign up and volunteer. Also, we have a building project. I'm like, man, like, do I really want to be a part of this? Like, I think this really could scare off newcomers. Of all the items on this list, I feel like this one could scare off newcomers the most because you could be a church that's a good fit for them and they might just hear so much promotion and recruitment that they're like, I don't want to be a part of a church where like I'm being bled dry in that sense. I want to serve, I want to be a part of it, but like there needs to be some balance. And unfortunately, you could stuff too much into a single Sunday morning and that could have negative effects.
Yeah.
And I think the solution here is really simple. It's just like, hey, be mindful of how many asks that you're giving in a service. And if you know, okay, we were already talking about this and we're talking about this, maybe we'll save this for next week.
Yeah, totally. It just takes a little bit of foresight, maybe a month at a time, maybe 4 weeks at a time, just saying like, okay, we need to announce these things. We do have a building project coming up. We do need volunteers in kids' church. Like these things are real, but kind of just placing them appropriately, spreading out the wealth across those 4 weeks so that you're not announcing all of them on one Sunday, but maybe 1 or 2 each Sunday over the course of a month. Next one, Inaccessible Bible Teaching. User at Mule Rider for Life says, I think there may be a trend with making the services a bit more basic and easier to understand, grasping general ideas. Then the meat and potatoes will be form yourself, reading and studying along with your discipleship classes.
So this kind of goes along with the traditions and jargon. You know, how deep are you going to get into exposition in the Bible?
Yeah.
And again, if you choose to get deep, how do you make that level of depth accessible to folks? You don't want to go so deep that you're like, hey, if you're not coming in with this much prerequisite knowledge, you will be completely lost. On the other side of things, you don't want to stay so shallow that you don't invite people into some of the deeper wisdom of Scripture that is often some of the most substantive, some of the most challenging, but it's in that challenge that you're like, this is where it talks about like following Jesus is tough. Like this is like the stuff that I really have to wrestle with. And so again, I think the best example of this is in the same way we make our physical spaces accessible, right? You got the steps and then you've got the ramp. And so it's like, are we getting rid of the steps? No, we're not getting rid of the steps. They're still what 98% of people use, but we're also going to have a ramp. And yes, that is going to require a little bit extra on top of the steps, but it makes so that this space is accessible for all people. You don't have to quit what you're doing. Just what can we do to make it accessible for the others?
Yeah, and for like the expository Bible teachers that are listening, I don't think that this feedback necessitates you changing your teaching method because that's valuable. I think, and we've touched on it already, I think maybe just adding a little bit of a little bit more language to define maybe some academic terms as you continue to teach the way you do, just adding like, hey, if you've never heard this word before, this is what this means. And sprinkling that in as you go might be enough to get people on board who aren't as academic or maybe don't listen to that type of teaching usually. But you could certainly, I think you painted a good picture. You could certainly build a proverbial or metaphorical ramp just by building a couple bridges with some words. What about this one, Braden? Nowhere to sit.
So this person had a lot of items in their comment.
They really did. At Eric Gideon 9237.
I mean, you can read them all if you want, but I specifically put this in here for number 4, nowhere to sit.
Yeah, Eric had a lot to say. Dirty looks, no one to greet, intimidation, nowhere to sit, no new programs, very unwelcoming attitude towards singles, interesting, and number 7, threats. So I don't know what that one's about, but let's tackle nowhere to sit.
So I was at church on Sunday.
Yeah.
And I arrive on time because I'm a very timely person. And I found my seat and I was seated there. And then I was like, oh, it's pretty empty today. It's summertime. That's how it happens. And then very quickly into the service, I was like, wow, it really filled in quick. And people were walking around and they didn't know where to sit. And our church has this great thing where people will stand there, volunteers watching to see if anyone looks like, and they will find a seat for them.
Awesome.
Because they recognize that it's really uncomfortable when everyone has a seat and you're standing there like, and then you have to walk and you kind of got to peek your head around the corner and see, oh, is there a seat there? And you maybe, hey, can you move in one so I can sit there? And so we have ushers that are situated just to do that. And you can do this not just for seating, but parking as well. A lot of churches that have limited parking will do a thing where it's like, flash your lights if you're new, and then they'll lead you to a VIP spot, because that's another thing that can make things difficult. If you've been to a place before, you know, like the parking situation. Let me tell you, we go to a lot of events downtown Toronto, and I have been doing this for my whole life, and I'm still trying to find like the perfect parking spot. Every time we find a good one, it's like, but the highway is too far away, and it takes us an extra hour to get on the highway to leave this city. So congested after every single Friday night event. When you have a good parking spot, it makes things a lot more comfortable. And at church, surely you know the rhythms of traffic, and you know, I always park here, and that parking spot's always taken. If you're new, it might be not as enjoyable. And so churches with limited parking have that. Same goes for seating. It's just like getting people from one station to the next. If it's not easy, it just makes the experience less good. You've surely walked into a coffee shop before, and like people are standing, and you're like, are they waiting for their drinks? Or are they like in line for their drinks? And then you have to go up and you're like, hi, do you know, is this, like this happened to us recently.
Yeah.
Like a visually impaired person had to come up to us in Union Station in Toronto and was like, are you in line or not? And we directed her to the line, and she needed us because she was visually impaired. But guess what? We were there 5 minutes earlier, and we were like,
made the same mistake.
I don't know where we're supposed to go.
Yeah.
And you know what? I'm still thinking about that. And you might say, Brady, you're soft. Sure I am, but like just a little signage. Just a little bit.
Here's a way that your church can really go above and beyond when it comes to seating. Making sure that you have accessible seating. So being mindful of like folks with wheelchairs, and where can you remove, if you have seats like ours where you can like detach them and remove them, can you remove one so that they can sit where a chair would be, so that they don't have to sit in the aisle? Thinking about accessibility. And then also thinking about family with young kids. Like if you invite all the kids into the worship time of your service, like you keep them in for singing, make some space, usually at the back, where there is more space in between the rows. Like at our church, we've actually removed every other row at the back for an area for families with young kids. And since we did that, the feedback we've gotten has been so good, which is like, this is amazing. Our kids can be kids on the ground. We don't have to restrict them to this small space. They can have space to color or play or read while we worship. And we just feel so much more comfortable in this worship space because you made the effort to make space for us. So take that and do with it what you will.
And before we get to the final example, that brings to mind something, because people are going to listen and watch this and think to themselves like, man, you sure are going to a lot of lengths just to make people comfortable. The gospel is not comfortable, which is like not applicable in this sense. If your church does anything for kids, you are already going to great lengths to make ministry accessible to people.
Yeah.
You are doing it for people that have kids. You have kids ministry so that people can like put their kids in kids ministry and then like go to big church themselves. Because many churches deem it very challenging to do church when the service is full of kids. So you've already done this. You already have a value for this. And this is what is so strange, I find, when talking to churches about new things, when they're like, I can pinpoint, you have a value already in church that's expressing this. We're just saying that same value could be expressed elsewhere. And they're deciding, no, here is where we draw the line. And certainly we have to draw lines so long as we understand, yes, this has merit, but like we realize for this reason and this reason we can't do it. If you're just like sloughing this off and being like, soft, well, okay, you probably have this value expressed in your church currently already. So at the very least, let's all call ourselves soft, or talk about why we're going to express it in this one way. Yes, for parents, we are going to do this, but for singles, we're not. And that leads us to number 10.
Yes. Eric from the last one, he mentioned it already, but this user at Atris is just going to put the exclamation point on it. This is singles feeling left out. They say, even though I've been going to my local church for 3 years, I still feel out of place because I'm single with no kids. I even stopped going to family events because I didn't want to be that guy at the table intruding on people's family time.
A 40-year-old man is nearly twice as likely to never be married in 2022 compared to 2008. It's Ryan Burge Graphs About Religion.
Wow.
Twice as likely to never be married. That's a span of 14 years.
That feels crazy to me.
This is a new phenomenon. It's not new to churches. We've been neglecting singles for a very long time. Yeah. But it used to be like, well, 80% of our ministry is like families. Sure. And like we only have so many resources. And I just want this to be very clear because it happened so quickly. It's probably not something on a lot of our radar. There are more older single people now dramatically than ever before. And church is made historically for families. And singles are probably feeling left out of church. So how can we make ministry accessible to them? How can we make them feel at home in our ministries? Because otherwise, they're just not going to come because they're going to feel like they have no place. Yeah. And guess what? There's a lot of them.
Yes. And the answer is not with a singles ministry that is basically like speed dating. Like that's not the answer.
Love is Blind Church?
Yeah, that is not the answer.
Into the pods!
And so this is something that I'm glad we're talking about on this show. And a lot of folks have been talking about for the last decade or so. Like, how do we engage singleness in the church and acknowledge that it can be holy and is no less holy than being married with kids, and that you can embody like the image of the story of God in a single lifestyle. And how do we don't really have answers to this, certainly not on this episode of this show, but the question remains, like, how do we invite singles into the fullness of life in our church without, like this person said, like feeling like they are intruding on family business when it just shouldn't be true at all.
10 ways churches scare off newcomers. Come on, pro-church people, let us know in the comments. Should Alex keep calling himself one of the pastors at this church? And thanks as always for your time, attention, and trust. We'll talk to you next Wednesday. Sorry, your mom's texting me.
About swimming lessons.
That's right.
Come on. Well,
no, I also wanted to look up one thing. No, so you mentioned. I was
going to say the next one's lack of structure, which is perfect for this time of the episode because it's falling apart.
And that's cute. She texted me. She's like, "Hey, it's been thundering. I don't know if we can do swimming lessons." I was like, "Sounds good. Do you have Britt's number?" "Yes, now I do. Sorry to bother you." No worries.
I'll text her right now and say, "Mom,
just
we're recording a
podcasting
podcast
with your son."